coronavirus has rekindled questions surrounding China's wildlife markets, which may be linked to the outbreak. What has been the Chinese government's stance on these markets and efforts to keep wild animals safe? And restlessness was the buzzword at this year's Munich Security Conference. What did leaders have to say about competition, cooperation, and a world that's a little less West? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Di Xin. The coronavirus, preliminarily traced to a wildlife market in Wuhan, has thrust China's wildlife protection efforts back into the spotlight. On Monday, news came that the upcoming session of the 13th National People's Congress Standing Committee is suggested to review a draft decision on banning illegal wildlife trade and eliminating the bad habits of eating wild animals. Chinese authorities already announced in late January that no wildlife can be transported or sold in any markets or online across the country until the public health emergency is over. So how significant is the latest move, and what's the link to public health? Joining me from Taipei is Paul Littlefair, Head of International at the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. From Houston, Texas, Peter J. Lee, a China policy specialist at Humane Society International, and in Beijing via Skype, Zhao, Country Director of World Animal Protection in China. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. I want to ask Paul first. What do you think the outbreak has told us about the importance of wild animal protection? Although at this moment, experts have pointed to the potential source of wildlife as the source of this new virus, and yet it has been scientifically established, but a lot of discussion has been had on that. And from the latest news about the discussion on China's top legislator, it seems that using this opportunity, China is also ready to look at this issue in a very serious manner once again. Paul.
Thank you. Yes, good evening. I think obviously there's a context here that takes us right back to the 2002 SARS outbreak, 2002-2003, which was definitely traced to wildlife markets in Guangdong. And at that time, the authorities reacted locally to close down that market and some others, I think, for a matter of months, but then they reopened again. So the issue of the core issue here really is the mixing of wild-caught wildlife, farmed wildlife, other livestock species, poultry and other ordinary domestic livestock species in the same place, being sold live and also being slaughtered on site as well. So I'm not an epidemiologist or a biologist, but clearly from other experts, it's clear that that sort of process is at the root of the problem, really. And so since 2003, the focus really, from my point of view as an animal protection, animal welfare specialist, has been on how can the public be educated to understand what the potential risks are of having animals mixed in that way. It's a huge challenge, and there are lots of considerations when it comes to people's propensities or desire to want to eat wild animals, wildlife, custom, tradition, perhaps to some extent, but also a modern trend as well, which we've seen in China over the last 20 years as people have become more wealthy, to look for more exotic, more, so to speak, interesting things to eat, rare things to eat, and so on. So there are lots of very complicated factors that have led to this ongoing situation, but behind it all is really a lack of regulation around this. So I was very pleased to see today that the NPC Standing Committee were preparing to look at this particular issue.
Well, China is not without legislation on the wildlife protection. I mean, since, for instance, 1988, there have been the wildlife protection law, and it has been revised, and several steps have been made, and yet it seems that it has been inadequate to address the potential cruelty or risks to public health, or to it has not been able to contain the bad habit, the old bad habit of eating wild animals, some of them under protection. So, Mr. Li, help us understand exactly why the current legal framework has been inadequate or ineffective to really adequately protect wildlife as they should.
Yeah, China has a wildlife protection law which was adopted in 1988, as you just mentioned. It went into effect in 1989. It was revised in 2015 and 2016. However, this law was based on the assumption that the wildlife animals are natural resources and not, wildlife species that have their own independent and ecological importance. So that's why the entire law has been, the entire law is full of articles and stipulations for how to use wildlife animals, how to commercialize the wildlife resources, and how to breed the wildlife resources for different purposes, like for animal performance and for, medicinal purposes. So the law itself is not a law for protecting wildlife animals, but for protecting the business interests. Now, I have to disagree a little bit with Mr. Littlefair, is that China does have some of the laws and regulations that could have been used to regulate the market. But the thing is this: China has a huge, shortage of regulation, resources, because China has the world's biggest livestock industry, which serves 1.4 billion people. So their food safety is much, much important. So the resources has been used to, regulate that part of the industry. But the wildlife eating, the wildlife breeding industry is very tiny. It generates a revenue of 125 billion yuan, which is about 20 billion US dollars. It's very tiny. It's like a drop in the bucket in China's gigantic GDP. So the Chinese, regulatory resources could not be diverted into that part, which serves the small minority of people. So I would say it's a regulatory resources, inadequate, but has to be in the livestock industry.
Okay, so 2 points you mentioned there, the lack of regulatory resources, and also the basically starting point, the philosophy of China's regulation in terms of wildlife, not to protect them as wildlife per se, but to look at them from a kind of natural resources that are to be harnessed. Mr. Zhao, what is your understanding of the situation? Do you agree with Mr. Li?
I think wildlife eating and wildlife breeding is not unique to China. This is a phenomenon across the world. China has done a great job in banning the elephant ivory, and also done a great job in environmental protection. And I believe it's the time. China is the time to also perform a model role in terms of ban the wildlife consumption. Wild animals, if we keep them in the wild, keep them in the nature, and protect the natural habitat, they are great treasures, because they are the important component of the ecological chain. So they can ensure biodiversity, they can ensure great environment and blue mountains and clean water. But if we hunt animals or extract animals from the biological chain, they pose great threat to human beings and our health. So I think both in the SARS outbreak and in this coronavirus outbreak, we must say the government reaction to this emergency is excellent, is quite courageous. So the government has issued the temporary ban, and we hope this temporary ban can become permanent. And I agree with what Peter just said. Compared with the huge, gigantic economy, this wildlife industry economy is minor. It's minor, and the country should balance on this.
So I have this question, because when China talks about revising, stepping up its effort, it's been talking about banning illegal wildlife trade. Does it mean that there will still be legal wildlife trade? Paul, how do you look at to what extent should the business transaction concerning wildlife be tolerated? Should there be distinction? Will it be effective if China enacts a law which tries to regulate only certain part of wildlife related transaction?
Yes. The notice I saw today, the wording of it, I thought was very interesting. The phrase used was 滥事, which indicates maybe sort of excessive use or wanton use of eating of wildlife. So does that imply that some eating of wildlife would not be excessive or wanton, would be actually permissible? And if so, would that be in terms of quantity, in terms of species, in terms of whether animals are actually taken from the wild or farmed wild animals? All of those questions would still be there. My suspicion is, obviously, China is in a position to make great strides in this area now, and sometimes it takes a crisis like this. This is an unprecedented crisis, really. SARS was big, but this is looking to be bigger. And it takes something like this to really change things in a big way. And one advantage China has is when a policy decision is made, it can make changes very rapidly. The challenge, and I agree with Peter Lee, is enforcement. So it's all very well passing legislation or regulations, but on the ground you need to have enforcement bodies that understand and are resourced enough to be able to do that. But most importantly, you of course need the public behind you as much as possible. And I think at this point, public opinion is very much in favour of regulating wildlife consumption.
Okay.
So it seems like a crucial point in time.
Finally, let's take a look at one comment we have seen on Twitter at the account of this user by the name of Damaris Briscoe, who is also which is also an opinion piece from NBC News, saying, as much as I love pangolins and don't want to see them driven to extinction by the illegal wildlife trade, I'm concerned to see environmentalism and conservationism building on racist narratives. It seems that it's representing some people's opinions. Mr. Lee, what's your reaction to the kind of possible racist narratives that's emerging?
I would say that wildlife protection is transnational, transcultural. There is, of course, there might be, racial, profiling regarding the Chinese eating wildlife animals. But I would say that wildlife eating in China is not a majority's, eating habit. It is not part of the mainstream food culture. So we have been talking to Westerners, so don't, stereotyping Chinese. We don't eat wildlife. But I would say that wildlife eating in China has very little to do with Chinese culture, but a lot to do with commercial interest. It has been promoted by the business industry. That's why I believe that if the Chinese government should take a resolute, decision and to end the trade, there should be no problem, because, you cannot find, you go to a regular Chinese, kitchen, you open the refrigerator, you don't see, or even private home, you don't see, a frozen snake in the refrigerator. So it's not a part of a Chinese, a mainstream culture.
Right.
Now, in the last 30 years, China's, business industry has been, monopolizing the public discourse regarding wildlife use, and they have promoting wildlife as, you know, good for conservation, good for public health, and good for, you know, poverty reduction. That's just not, you know, substantiated by facts. I believe personally strongly that China has come to a crossroad to make decision.
Okay.
The national interest of 1.4 billion people's, you know, safety, you know, stands higher than the parochial interest of wildlife business interest.
All right. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Paul Littlefair, Head of International Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Peter Lee, China Policy Specialist and Humane Society International, and Zhao, Zhonghua, Country Director of World Animal Protection.